everyone. We're in a series right now called What in the World is Happening? So grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and let's take a look at what's going on in the world right now. So what in the world is happening? If you've been following my teachings for a while, you'll know that we are in a series of war cycles that began in September of 2000. These war cycles have been going every 7 years, and they'll continue until Messiah returns. Right now we're in the third war cycle, and on this update I'd like to give you some details of what's been happening in this third war cycle and how they relate to end-time prophecy. You can see from this graphic the first war cycle started in September 30th of 2000, and each war cycle has become more intense and larger. Basically, more things are happening in the world until we get to our final war cycle that starts in September 7th of 2021. Now, in the past, we have linked these war cycles to the blood moons. If you haven't had a chance to watch my teaching on that, I would advise you go back and look at the Blood Moons Conference for a full teaching on the war cycles and the blood moons and how they're connected. But for today, I just want to go ahead and look at what has happened just in the first 2 years of this war cycle. Now, as you can see in these 7-year war cycles, the first one, which began in September of 2000, some very important things happened, but it started out in low intensity. For example, jihad was declared on September 30th of 2000 that kicked off this first war cycle. Then the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. We had the financial crash of 2001, and then the Arab Spring began. The second war cycle began September 13th of 2007. And as you see, a lot happened, even more happened. Financial crash of 2008 happened. Obama was elected as President of the United States, which we'll cover in a little more detail later on in this teaching. The Arab Spring spreads, ISIS rises and declares a caliphate, and then Hamas comes to power in Gaza and begins their attacks on Israel. This third war cycle began September 24th of 2014, and it goes until September 7th of 2021. So many things have happened in the first 2 years of this war cycle that I wanted to do a separate teaching on this and show all the different things that have happened in the last 2 years. Before I get into that, though, I want you to look at this next graphic to understand how Islam plays into the judgment of the nations, because these war cycles and the eclipses were all warning us of the rise of radical Islam. The judgment of the nations through the ancient enemies of Israel, which today would be the Islamic nations, and the final harvest and restoration of all things, including the 12 tribes of Israel, the return of Yeshua or Jesus, and the reestablishment of the kingdom of David. But for right now, just before we get into all the things that have happened in the first 2 years, let's look at this graphic. Now, if you remember in my teaching, the 4 war cycles were equated to the 4 blood moons with a solar eclipse that happened right in the middle of the 4 blood moons and the 4 war cycles. This midpoint eclipse happened on Nisan 1, which was March 20th of 2015. Now remember, a solar eclipse equals judgment on the nations. A lunar eclipse or a blood moon is equivalent to judgment on Israel. This was a solar eclipse. This occurred over the North Pole, which was the top of the world. This is the only time in history we have ever had a solar eclipse over the North Pole or the top of the world. The reason that this is so important is because I believe that this solar eclipse was warning of an Islamic judgment on the entire world and the spread of Islam, or the rise of a global caliphate. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at some of the things that have happened in just the first 2 years of this third war cycle. So first of all, let's look at what happened to Israel and the nations. First of all, ISIS gains money and power and expands their attacks into the nations. We see an increased persecution of Jewish people in the nations and the rise of the BDS movement. We saw war in Syria that accelerated quite a bit. We'll talk about this in a little more detail in a little bit to understand how the war in Syria has played out into an Islamic invasion of the entire world. We see the Syrian refugee crisis, which you can see as an Islamic invasion of Europe and the US. We have the rise of ISIS terrorist attacks in Europe, causing the return of Judah to Israel. I do want to say something about that in a second. Remember, we're talking about the judgment and harvest. Harvest includes the harvest of both Judah, which would be the house of Judah, and Ephraim, the house of Ephraim, out of the nations back to the land. In this case, we're seeing these attacks, specifically the ones that happened in France, against the Jewish people, which is the house of Judah. Now, what has happened because of this is that the Jewish people are starting to go back to Israel. They're emigrating out of the nations to get away from the terrorist attacks and going back to the land. This is part of the harvest. So Judah is being harvested out of the nations, which is really exciting. On the other hand, it's really hard to watch because it's being done through terrorist attacks or persecution. The next thing we saw, knife and car attacks in Israel began. Now I'll say something about that real quick. The knife and car attacks, this would be like the idea of a lone wolf terrorist, the small slaughter knife. And you can understand a little bit about that by going back to my teaching on the 4 horses of Revelation. In that teaching, I show the rise of Islam through the 4 horses by going into the original Greek and Hebrew. Now the second horse, which was the red horse of terror, the rider is carrying not a sword, but a small slaughter knife. And I believe that red horse is manifesting in both Israel and the United States as lone wolf terrorist attacks, slaughter knives, in a lot of the Middle Eastern nations by the beheading of Christians with a slaughter knife. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that teaching, that would also be a really good one to watch. Finally, these last 2 events, the rise of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the leader of ISIS, as a possible Mahdi, and the rise of Erdogan, who is the leader of Turkey, as the possible Mahdi. Now these last 2 things have just happened in this war cycle as well. The leader of ISIS has declared a caliphate and is declaring himself as the leader of that caliphate. We'll have to see how that plays out. The most recent event was the event in Turkey where Erdogan was out of the country. There was a coup that occurred in Turkey. Erdogan came back in, put down the coup, and then declared himself the leader. In a sense, a lot of people were calling him a Mahdi, or the rise of the Mahdi. He used the coup as an opportunity to kind of purge the nation of his enemies and to establish an Islamist state. We'll have to watch that carefully to see how it plays out. And at this point, I'm not making a judgment on either one. We're just watching to see what happens. Now, let's take a look at what has happened in the last 2 years in the U.S. This is our 3rd war cycle in the U.S. We have seen racial unrest and riots in the U.S. We saw the end of the U.S. Constitution and rule of law, with the United States becoming a lawless nation. The Pope meets with our administration and officially supports the Palestinians. Then we had the Pope and the UN call for a world government due to climate change. Now again, this relates to the 4 horses of Revelation. On the 4th horse, which is a pale green horse, we had a chance to show how the Pope would bring in a global caliphate using climate change as a reason to bring in a global government. So I think you'll find that teaching very interesting. We see that the U.S. brokers a nuclear deal with Iran. We see lone wolf attacks in the U.S. And finally, we're in the time of the elections. Now, the elections are interesting. Again, we'll just have to watch to see what happens with this, because I believe that whoever wins the election here in the United States this year will set the course for the remainder of this war cycle. This war cycle will end in 2021. So we have about 4.5 years left in this war cycle, which would mean that a president will be elected and they will be in charge of the United States until the end of this war cycle, when again we will shift and we'll see what happens there. Something to watch very carefully. Now I want to talk really quickly about the countries of the Arab Spring, because I want to bring out a couple of points, a couple of things that have happened in the last couple of war cycles that I think are key in understanding the establishment of a global caliphate. And the first thing we're going to look at is the countries of the Arab Spring. Now you remember the Arab Spring started in the second war cycle. But I wanted to lay a foundation so you could understand why that's important. So let's take a look at this map. These are the countries of the Arab Spring. And you can see we have North Africa, we have areas of the Middle East, leading all the way up into just north of Iran. Compare this map to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire included also northern Africa, and going all the way up Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and then it goes into Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, that area as well. The reason I bring this up is because there's some really good teaching that the final beast system is the revival of the Ottoman Empire. So this is not a time for me to do a teaching on that, but there's some really good teachings out there that you can go to and look to see the rise of the Islamic Caliphate as the beast system or the final beast system of Revelation. But I think these maps are interesting to see what happened. Now, in line with that, we have to understand how the Arab Spring happened and the role that the U.S. played in the Arab Spring. Now, I mentioned in the second war cycle the rise of Obama as the leader here in the free world and as our American president. Now, I believe this is important prophetically, and I want to show you why that is. Our administration was very supportive in facilitating the Arab Spring. They supported the rise of democracy in these Islamic nations, supported them militarily, financially, and every way there was. And what we have found now after the rise of the Arab Spring is what we have is Islamic nations, or the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. But this has to happen in the end of days, because I personally believe that the Islamic Caliphate will be the beast system of the end of days. And if you've watched any of my teachings in the past, you understand I believe that because that's the rising of the ancient enemies of Israel, which included, remember, Persia, Babylon, Egypt, Turkey, Rome. These are all ancient Islamic nations. Rome, a lot of people equate that to just the Romans, but that area included a lot of the Islamic nations of today. And you'll have to go back into my other teachings to see how that equates. So let's look at the rise of Obama as a world leader. I believe that President Obama is God's appointed leader for the West. The reason I believe that is because of his name in Hebrew. So let's look at his name in Hebrew. Barack Obama. Barak in Hebrew means lightning. Bama in Hebrew means the high place. So what we have Barack Obama, the lightning from the high place. Now the Bama in Hebrew, oftentimes in prophetic literature, relates to the high places of pagan worship. So I think that would be more along this line. So we can see that Barack Obama was the lightning from the high place that struck in the Middle East. Zechariah 9:13-15. I will bend Judah as I bend my bow and fill it with Ephraim. I will rouse your son Zion against your sons Greece and make you like a warrior's sword. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning, or Barak. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. The reason I brought up this scripture is because you can see that the lightning plays out in end-time prophecy. In the scripture, let's look at it again. I will bend Judah as I bend my bow. This relates to the house of Judah. And I will fill it with Ephraim. That relates to the house of Ephraim. This is Judah and Ephraim coming together in the end of days to begin to fight the final battle for the land. I will rouse your sons Zion, which would be all of Israel, against your sons Greece. Now Greece, oftentimes we think of Greece as being the land of Greece. But in ancient thought, or in ancient prophetic literature, it's Yavan, or Turkey. And we see Turkey coming into play right now. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning, or Barak. I believe that our president was used as an arrow. And God used him to flash, to be the lightning from the high place, to strike that area of the Middle East. Then the sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. This talks about the final battle and the end of days. I'd like to bring out something that's an Islamic prophecy. A lot of people, especially in the Judeo-Christian world, we tend to think that only Christians can prophesy. But as we've learned in the Shemitah year prophecy, which was prophesying about these war cycles, there are prophecies in other areas as well. The Jewish people oftentimes prophesy about things, especially the sages. But I believe that there's prophecy also being released in Islam, and I'd like to present this prophecy to you. At the end of times and just before the return of the Mahdi, a tall black man will assume the reins of government in the West, commanding the strongest army on earth. The new ruler in the West will carry a clear sign from the third Imam, whose name was Hussein ibn Ali. The tradition concludes, Shiites should have no doubt that he, meaning Hussein, is with us. Now, in a curious coincidence, Obama's first and second names, Barack Hussein, means the blessing of Hussein in Arabic and Persian. Obama in Persian reads Obama, which means he is with us, which in effect means, this full translation would mean, the blessing of Hussein is with us. I bring in this Islamic prophecy just to show that the fact that our president was raised up by God for such a time of this was confirmed in Islamic prophecy as well. So again, I go back to my original statement that President Obama was placed as leader in the West because he was God's appointed man to bring about the end of days. Now, let's talk real briefly about the rise of ISIS, because ISIS is an important player in this third war cycle. And I believe ISIS will continue for the rest of the war cycles as well. ISIS are the same people that judged Israel and Judah. You could equate them to the ancient Assyrians, which included Syria and Iraq. You could also equate them to Amalek, who is their eternal enemy. Now, Amalek, a lot of people don't believe that Amalek is really, the ancient people of Amalek really exist anymore, because we haven't been able to trace their history to the present time. But in prophetic literature, Amalek would be the ancient enemy of Israel. And the sages believe that the only person who can defeat Amalek would be the Messiah. So when Yeshua returns as Messiah, his first assignment will be to destroy and defeat Amalek. The other thing that the Jewish prophets and sages say is that Judah, the house of Judah themselves, all by themselves, cannot defeat Amalek. Even the Messiah with Judah can't defeat Amalek. The only way they can defeat him is for the house of Ephraim, or Israel, to come join Judah, and together as all 12 tribes under the leadership of the Messiah can their ancient enemy Amalek finally be defeated. Now, ISIS was funded and armed by the United States government. Now, whether you believe this was happened accidentally or on purpose, I don't think it really matters. But the fact that ISIS could not have developed to the world power that it is today without the help of United States weapons and money that were sent into the Syrian war. So our government was supporting the Syrian rebels. As ISIS began to advance, they began to take over a lot of the strongholds that were held by the Syrian rebels, the ones who were fighting against Assad in Syria. When that happened, they began to gain the weapons and the money and the power that the United States government had provided for the rebels. In a sense, we began to arm and empower ISIS at greater and greater levels. It's also important to understand that ISIS could not have taken over Iraq if we hadn't pulled out. So we had to pull out of Iraq in order for ISIS to gain power in that country as well. Now, they declared a caliphate in June of 2014. That's important because, again, the final caliphate, I believe, is the beast system. So they're going to need a leader to that caliphate, and the Mahdi is going to have to rise as that leader. A lot of people believe the Mahdi is the equivalent to our Antichrist. I don't know at this point, so we'll have to watch and see how that plays out. Finally, we see that ISIS was supported by Turkey and was caught buying ISIS oil. Now we see ISIS, or Turkey, is being pulled into this conflict as well. So we can see Syria, great unrest in Syria, and the civil war in Syria has caused several things. The rise of ISIS, the bringing in of Turkey. Turkey's now involved with this. And now we see Russia coming alongside Turkey, the United States developing a coalition to fight against Assad, and we have a coalition of nations, which all happens in the end of days. Now let's look at this map real quick. We can see ISIS-controlled land on the left compared to ancient Assyria, which was the ancient enemy of Israel in the times of the prophets. So ISIS-controlled land on the left, you see very, very similar to the area where the Assyrian Empire was. So you could almost say that this is, again, a rise of the ancient enemy, Assyria. Now, because of all the unrest that happened in Syria, we had the Syrian refugee crisis. And remember, we talked, when we first started this little section right here, we talked about the solar eclipse over the top of the world, which meant a global invasion of Islam. I believe the blood moons were warning of that global invasion, this last final invasion by the ancient enemies of Israel, as both a form of judgment and to force the harvest at the end of the ages. Now, what have we seen happen? We've seen, because of this whole conflict that's happened in Syria and the rise of ISIS, we're seeing this influx of refugees, and they have flooded into Europe. Included with a lot of those refugees are part of ISIS. So in Europe now we're seeing an increase of attacks, including lone wolf attacks, ISIS attacks, individual attacks, and the establishment of Sharia law. Whether that happens here in the United States, we'll have to wait and see. Now the question comes to us, how long can this last? This is a lot of information, a lot of things that have happened in just the first 2 years of this war cycle. You see in this graphic, where are we now and what's coming? In 2016, you are here. We are only 2 years into this war cycle. It's going all the way to 2021. In 2021, we have the fall feasts, which I believe may be very prophetic. That begins the final war cycle, September 7th of 2021, ending September 30th of 2028. In our next teaching, I'm going to go in a little bit of detail on Pharaoh's prophetic dreams. Where we are right now you can see in this chart right here, we've had the first 2 war cycles, which were the fat cows and the thin cows. Right now we are in the 3rd war cycle, which represents the fat wheat, what may be happening in the fat wheat, and then coming up after that is the thin wheat. And then we're also going to look at where are we on the prophetic timeline. Well, I hope you enjoyed this first teaching of what in the world is happening. Join us for the next teaching on Coffee with My Friends.